Sarah Mitchell pressed her face against the cold window of the general store, watching the townspeople hurry past on the dusty main street of Willow Creek. At 19, she had grown accustomed to the sideways glances and whispered conversations that followed her wherever she went. The scar that ran from her left temple to her jawline told a story she wished she could forget, but the people of this small Texas town never let her. The accident had happened 3 years ago when she was helping her father repair the windmill on their small ranch. A sudden gust of wind had sent a piece of broken metal flying, slashing across her face before anyone could react. The doctor had done his best, but the wound had healed badly, leaving behind a raised, angry line that seemed to fascinate and repel people in equal measure. Sarah's mother had died when she was just 12, leaving her to care for her increasingly frail father and manage their struggling ranch with the help of their only remaining hand, old Pete. The work was hard, but Sarah found solace in the wide-open spaces and the company of their small herd of cattle. It was in town where her real troubles began. She pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders and stepped out into the afternoon heat. The list of supplies clutched in her hand was short, but every item on it was essential. They needed flour, salt, and ammunition for the rifle that kept the coyotes away from their livestock. More importantly, they needed the medicine that kept her father's persistent cough from getting worse. As she made her way toward the mercantile, Sarah noticed a group of young women gathered near the church steps. Among them was Rebecca Thompson, the banker's daughter, whose golden curls and perfect complexion made her the envy of every girl in town and the desire of every unmarried man. Rebecca's voice carried clearly across the street, and Sarah's heart sank as she realized she was the topic of their conversation. "I heard she scared away another suitor last week," Rebecca was saying, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. Poor Mr. Henderson took one look at that face and made excuses about needing to visit his sick aunt in Houston. The other girls giggled behind their gloved hands, and Sarah quickened her pace, hoping to reach the store before they noticed her. But luck was not on her side. "Oh, look, here comes the monster herself," Rebecca called out, her voice loud enough for half the street to hear. "Sarah, dear, you really should consider wearing a veil. You're frightening the children." The words hit Sarah like physical blows, but she had learned long ago not to respond. Engaging with Rebecca only made things worse. She kept walking, her eyes fixed on the mercantile door just 20 yards away, but Rebecca wasn't finished. She stepped into Sarah's path, her perfect pink dress rustling with each movement. "I'm speaking to you, freak. Don't you have any manners?" Sarah tried to step around her, but Rebecca moved to block her way again. The other girls formed a loose circle, their faces showing a mixture of excitement and discomfort at the confrontation unfolding before them. "Please, I just need to get to the store," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please." Rebecca mimicked in a high-pitched whine. How pathetic. No wonder no man will have you. Who would want to wake up to that face every morning? Something inside Sarah finally snapped. 3 years of cruel comments, sideways glances, and deliberate humiliation had built up like water behind a dam, and Rebecca's words were the final crack that sent everything flooding out. "At least my ugliness is only on the outside," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Yours goes all the way through." The circle of girls gasped, and Rebecca's face turned red with rage. Without warning, she raised her hand and slapped Sarah hard across the cheek, the sound echoing off the nearby buildings like a gunshot. "How dare you speak to me like that, you hideous creature!" Rebecca shrieked. "My father owns half this town, and your family owes him money. One word from me, and he'll foreclose on that pathetic excuse for a ranch you call home." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Sarah knew it was true. Her father had borrowed money from Thompson's bank to buy medicine and pay for repairs after a particularly harsh winter, and they were already behind on the payments. If Rebecca convinced her father to call in the loan, they would lose everything. But before Sarah could respond, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. A small crowd had gathered to watch the confrontation, and among them were some of the rougher men from the saloons. Their faces showed an ugly excitement, and she realized with growing horror that they were picking up stones from the street. "She's right, boys. called out Jake Morrison, a mean, drunk cowhand who had been thrown off more ranches than anyone could count. "This monster has been poisoning our town long enough. Time we did something about it." The first stone hit Sarah in the shoulder, spinning her around and nearly knocking her to the ground. The second caught her in the back as she tried to run, and she stumbled, her supply list scattering in the wind. "Run, monster, run!" someone shouted, and suddenly the air was filled with stones and jeers. Sarah ran as she had never run before, her long skirts tangling around her legs and threatening to trip her with every step. Behind her, she could hear the mob giving chase, their cruel laughter mixing with the thud of boots on packed earth. She turned down an alley between the barber shop and the gunsmith's store, hoping to lose them in the maze of back streets that she knew better than most. But the alley was a dead end, blocked by a tall wooden fence that she had no hope of climbing in her current state. Trapped, she turned to face her pursuers, pressing her back against the rough wooden planks. The mob had grown larger, fed by the excitement of the chase and the pack mentality that turned ordinary people into something ugly and dangerous. Jake Morrison stepped forward, a large rock in his meaty hand. "End of the line, freak. Time you learned your place in this town." Sarah closed her eyes and waited for the blow that would surely come. But instead of the impact of stone against flesh, she heard the distinctive sound of a gun being cocked. "I reckon that's far enough, boys." The voice was calm and steady, with the soft drawl of someone who had spent years under the open sky. Sarah opened her eyes to see a tall figure silhouetted against the mouth of the alley, his wide-brimmed hat casting his face in shadow. The newcomer stepped forward, and Sarah could see him more clearly. He was young, probably no more than 25, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his dusty shirt. His clothes marked him as a working cowboy, worn leather chaps, scuffed boots, and a gun belt that showed the kind of use that came from years on the trail. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. They were a deep green, like the color of grass after a spring rain, and they held a quiet strength that made the mob take an unconscious step backward. "This ain't your business, stranger," Jake Morrison growled, though the rock in his hand had lowered slightly. The cowboy's smile was cold as winter wind. "I'm making it my business. Now, I suggest you boys head on back to whatever hole you crawled out of before someone gets hurt." "There's a dozen of us and only one of you," Morrison replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "That's true," the cowboy agreed, his hand resting easily on the grip of his Colt. "But I only need one bullet to put you down, and I expect your friends here aren't quite as eager to die for your stupidity as you might think." The mob shifted nervously, and Sarah could see doubt creeping into their faces. This wasn't some frightened young woman they could terrorize with impunity. This was a man who carried himself like he had faced down trouble before and come out the winner. "Besides," the cowboy continued, his voice taking on a conversational tone that somehow made him even more dangerous, "I've got a real problem with grown men who throw rocks at women. Where I come from, we call that cowardice, and I have a powerful dislike for cowards." Morrison's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "She's a monster, a freak. She don't belong in decent society." The cowboy's eyes flicked to Sarah, taking in her torn dress and the fear in her eyes. When he looked back at Morrison, his expression had hardened even further. "I see a young lady who was minding her own business before you decided to act like a pack of wild dogs," he said quietly. "Now I'm going to count to 3, and if you're still standing here when I finish, we're going to have ourselves a serious disagreement. 1. The mob took another step back, but Morrison held his ground. "You can't fight all of us. 2. Several men at the back of the group decided they had pressing business elsewhere and melted away into the street. Others followed until only Morrison and 2 of his closest drinking companions remained. 3. The cowboy's hand moved so fast that Sarah barely saw it. One moment his gun was in its holster, and the next it was pointed directly at Morrison's chest. The speed and smoothness of the draw left no doubt about the man's skill with the weapon. Morrison stared down the barrel of the Colt for a long moment, his face pale despite his earlier bravado. Finally, he let the rock fall from his trembling hand. "This ain't over," he muttered. but he was already backing toward the alley entrance. "Yes, it is," the cowboy replied. "And if I hear of you bothering this lady again, you'll find out just how permanent over can be." Morrison and his remaining companions fled, their footsteps echoing off the buildings as they disappeared into the street. The cowboy waited until the sound faded completely before holstering his weapon and turning to Sarah. "Are you hurt, miss?" he asked, his voice gentle now that the danger had passed. Sarah tried to speak but found that her throat had closed up with emotion. The kindness in his voice after so much cruelty was almost more than she could bear. She managed to shake her head, though she could feel blood trickling from where one of the stones had caught her arm. The cowboy noticed the wound and stepped closer, pulling a clean bandana from his pocket. "May I?" he asked. And when Sarah nodded, he gently tied the cloth around her arm to stop the bleeding. His touch was careful and sure, the hands of someone accustomed to tending injuries on the trail. Sarah found herself studying his face as he worked, noting the small scar above his left eyebrow and the way his jaw tightened with concentration. "What's your name, miss?" he asked as he finished with the bandage. "Sarah," she whispered, still not quite believing that someone had stood up for her. "Sarah Mitchell. I'm pleased to make your acquaintance, Miss Mitchell." "I'm Daniel Hartwell, but most folks call me Dan." He stepped back and touched the brim of his hat. "I'm sorry you had to go through that. No one deserves to be treated like an animal." The simple kindness of his words broke down the last of Sarah's defenses, and she felt tears spilling down her cheeks. She wiped them away quickly, embarrassed by her weakness. "Thank you," she managed to say. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." Dan's jaw tightened again, and Sarah could see anger flickering in his green eyes. "Nothing was going to happen to you while I was around to prevent it. You have my word on that." There was something in his tone that made Sarah believe him completely. For the first time in 3 years, she felt safe in the presence of another human being. "I should go," she said reluctantly. "My father will be wondering where I am, and I still haven't gotten the supplies we need." "I'll walk with you to the store," Dan offered. "Make sure there's no more trouble." Sarah wanted to protest that she didn't need protection, but the truth was that she was still shaking from her encounter with the mob. Having Dan beside her would make the walk back to the Mercantile much easier. They made their way out of the alley and onto the main street, where the afternoon sun seemed much brighter than it had before. Sarah was acutely aware of the stares they attracted, but for once they weren't all directed at her. Dan's presence seemed to command respect, and she noticed that several men touched their hats respectfully as they passed. At the Mercantile, the elderly clerk, Mr. Jameson, looked up nervously as they entered. His eyes flicked between Sarah and Dan, clearly trying to assess the situation. "Miss Mitchell," he said cautiously, "I heard there was some trouble outside." "Nothing that can't be handled," Dan replied before Sarah could speak. "Miss Mitchell needs to do some shopping, and I'd appreciate it if you'd give her the same courtesy you'd show any other customer." There was steel beneath the polite words, and Mr. Jameson nodded quickly. Of course. What can I get for you today, Miss Mitchell?" Sarah handed over her list with trembling fingers, and the clerk began gathering the items. As he worked, she became aware that Dan was studying her profile, and she turned her face away self-consciously. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't what?" she asked, though she already knew what he meant. "Don't hide from me. You've got nothing to be ashamed of." Sarah looked at him in surprise, seeing nothing but sincerity in his eyes. It had been so long since someone had looked at her without flinching or turning away that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. "Most people find it difficult to look at," she said, her hand moving unconsciously to her scar. "Most people are fools," Dan replied matter-of-factly. "A scar doesn't define a person any more than the color of their hair or the size of their boots." The simple wisdom of his words struck Sarah like a revelation. She had spent 3 years allowing other people's reactions to define how she saw herself. But here was someone who seemed genuinely indifferent to her disfigurement. Mr. Jameson finished gathering her supplies and totaled the cost. Sarah's heart sank as she realized that the prices had gone up since her last visit, and she didn't have enough money to pay for everything on her list. "I'll have to leave the ammunition," she said quietly. starting to count out her meager coins. Dan stepped forward and placed a silver dollar on the counter. "That should cover the difference." "I can't let you do that," Sarah protested, but Dan was already picking up her packages. "Consider it an investment in future friendship," he said with a smile that transformed his whole face. "Besides, a ranch without ammunition is like a horse without shoes. It might work for a while, but trouble's sure to follow." As they left the store, Sarah found herself walking straighter than she had in months. The weight of Dan's packages in his arms seemed to have lifted a corresponding weight from her shoulders. "Where's your ranch?" Dan asked as they walked. "About 5 miles south of town, near Willow Creek. It's not much, just a small spread that my father started when I was little. I'm looking for work," Dan said casually. "Been on the trail for the better part of 2 years, and I'm ready to settle down for a while. You wouldn't happen to know of anyone hiring, would you?" Sarah's heart leaped at the suggestion, but she forced herself to be practical. "We can't afford to hire anyone. We can barely make ends meet as it is. What if I worked for room and board? I've got my own horse and gear, and I'm handy with tools and livestock." The offer was too good to be true, and Sarah found herself looking for the catch. Why would you want to work for nothing? You could find a paying job at any of the larger ranches. Dan was quiet for a moment, and Sarah wondered if she had offended him. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "I've worked for big outfits before. Good pay, but no soul to them. Just cattle and profit, and moving on when the season's done. I'm looking for something different now, a place where the work matters to someone." They had reached the edge of town, where Sarah's old mare was tied to the hitching post outside the bank. The horse nickered softly as she approached, and Sarah stroked her neck affectionately. "This is Belle," she said, introducing Dan to her mount. "She's getting on in years, but she's still got plenty of heart." Dan examined the horse with the practiced eye of someone who had spent his life around livestock. Good bone structure, steady eye. "I'd say she's got several good years left in her." Sarah began loading her supplies into the saddlebags, and Dan helped without being asked. His movements were efficient and careful, and she noticed that he took care not to overload one side. "If you're serious about the job," she said as she prepared to mount, "you could ride out tomorrow and meet my father." "But I should warn you that we really can't afford to pay wages. Room and board is payment enough," Dan assured her, "and the chance to work for people who appreciate the effort." Sarah swung into the saddle, grateful for Belle's steady nature. As she gathered the reins, she looked down at Dan, who was watching her with those remarkable green eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." "No need to thank me for doing what's right," Dan replied. "I'll see you tomorrow, Miss Mitchell." As Sarah rode out of town, she found herself looking back more than once. Dan remained where she had left him, watching until she was out of sight. For the first time in years, she was looking forward to tomorrow. The morning sun was painting the eastern sky pink and gold when Sarah heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching the ranch. She had been awake for hours, unable to sleep for thinking about Daniel Hartwell and his unexpected offer to work for them. Part of her had wondered if she had dreamed the entire encounter, but the gentle ache in her arm where the bandage covered her wound reminded her that it had all been real. She stepped out onto the porch of their small farmhouse, shading her eyes against the rising sun. A lone rider was approaching from the direction of town, and even at a distance she could recognize the easy way he sat his horse. Dan had kept his word. Her father, Thomas Mitchell, emerged from the barn where he had been milking their single cow. At 55, he looked older than his years, worn down by hard work and the persistent cough that had been getting worse over the past months. His gray hair was thinning, and his once powerful frame had become stooped with illness. But his eyes were still sharp as he watched the approaching stranger. "Expecting someone, daughter?" he asked, his voice rough from another night of coughing. "His name is Daniel Hartwell. He helped me in town yesterday and said he was looking for work." Sarah chose not to mention the details of her encounter with the mob. Her father had enough worries without adding her troubles to the list. Dan rode into the yard on a sturdy bay gelding that showed good care despite the dust of travel. His saddle was well worn but maintained, and Sarah noticed that his rifle was clean and properly secured. He dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who had spent more time in the saddle than on the ground. Mr. Mitchell? Dan approached with his hat in his hand, offering the respect due to an elder. I'm Daniel Hartwell. Your daughter mentioned you might have need of an extra hand. Thomas studied the young man with careful eyes, taking in everything from his steady gaze to the way he stood. Years of judging men and horses had given him an instinct for character, and something he saw in Dan seemed to satisfy him. What's your experience? Thomas asked bluntly. Been working cattle since I was 12, sir. Spent time on ranches in Kansas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. I can handle branding, roundups, fence work, and most anything else that needs doing around a spread. Why here? There are bigger outfits that pay better wages. Dan glanced at Sarah before answering, and she felt her cheeks warm under his gaze. Sometimes a man gets tired of moving around, Mr. Mitchell. Sometimes he's looking for a place where he can put down roots and make a real difference. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying Dan's face. Finally, he nodded toward the barn. Let's take a look at what we're working with here. The three of them walked to the barn where old Pete was already working on repairing a broken stall door. Pete had been with the family for 15 years, a grizzled cowhand in his 60s who had nowhere else to go when age started slowing him down. He looked up as they approached, his weathered face creasing into a frown at the sight of a stranger. Pete, this is Dan Hartwell, Thomas said. He's thinking about joining us. Pete grunted and returned to his work without comment. He had never been one for words, but Sarah could tell he was listening to every syllable of the conversation. Thomas led them through the barn, pointing out the various problems that needed attention. 3 of the 6 stalls needed repair, the roof leaked in 2 places, and the hayloft ladder was missing several rungs. Beyond the barn, their small herd of 30 cattle grazed in a pasture that was showing the effects of the dry summer. We're running about half the cattle this place could support, Thomas admitted, his pride clearly stinging at having to reveal their circumstances. Lost most of the herd 2 winters ago to a blizzard, and we haven't been able to build back up. Dan nodded thoughtfully as they walked. Sarah could see him mentally cataloging the work that needed to be done, and she held her breath, waiting for him to make excuses and ride away. Instead, he stopped at the corral fence and leaned against it, studying the horses they kept there. That's a fine-looking stallion, he said, pointing to a black horse that had been Thomas's pride and joy before illness slowed him down. That's Thunder, Sarah said, unable to keep the affection out of her voice. Father trained him from a colt. Good lines. Bet he could sire some excellent foals with the right mares. Dan's comment was casual, but Sarah could see the wheels turning in his mind. Ever think about getting into the horse business? Thomas laughed, but it turned into a coughing fit that bent him double. Sarah rushed to his side, supporting him until the spasm passed. When he straightened, there was blood on the handkerchief he pressed to his mouth. Horse business requires money we don't have, Thomas said when he could speak again, and time I might not have either. Dan's expression grew thoughtful, but he didn't comment on Thomas's obvious illness. Instead, he turned his attention to the practical matters at hand. What would you need from a hired hand, Mr. Mitchell? General ranch work. Fence mending, cattle tending, whatever needs doing. But like Sarah told you, we can't pay much. Room and board would be fine. I've got some money saved up, and I'm more interested in the work than the wages right now. Sarah saw her father's eyebrows rise at this unexpected answer. In his experience, cowboys worked for money, not for the satisfaction of the job. There's a room above the barn that's not much to look at, but it's dry and warm, Thomas offered. That would suit me fine. Old Pete finally looked up from his work, studying Dan with new interest. You got references, boy? Dan smiled at the question, clearly recognizing Pete as someone whose opinion carried weight. Worked for the Rocking R in Kansas for 2 years. Foreman's name was Jake Sullivan. Before that, I was with the Circle M in Oklahoma under Tom Bradley. Pete grunted again, but Sarah thought she detected approval in the sound. Anyone who could remember names and ranches was serious about their work. When would you want to start? Thomas asked. How about right now? Dan gestured toward the broken stall door that Pete was struggling with. Looks like that could use an extra pair of hands. Without waiting for permission, Dan shrugged out of his jacket and rolled up his sleeves. Within minutes, he and Pete were working together to align the warped door, their movements showing the easy coordination of experienced ranch hands. Sarah found herself watching Dan work, impressed by his willingness to dive in without being asked. His movements were efficient and sure, and she noticed that he deferred to Pete's experience without seeming to patronize the older man. "Seems like a good enough sort," Thomas said quietly, speaking so only Sarah could hear. "Question is, why's he really here?" Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks again. "What do you mean? Man like that could write his own ticket at any big ranch from here to Montana. Young, strong, clearly knows what he's about. There's got to be a reason he's willing to work for room and board on a struggling outfit like ours." Before Sarah could respond, Dan called out from the barn, "Mr. Mitchell, you might want to take a look at this." They hurried over to where Dan was examining the doorframe. He was running his fingers along the wood, his face grim. "This wasn't broken by accident," he said, pointing to several gouges in the wood. "Someone took an axe to this deliberately." Thomas's face darkened as he examined the damage. "When did this happen, Pete?" The old cowhand scratched his grizzled chin. "Noticed it yesterday morning when I came to feed. Figured maybe the wind had blown something against it." "No wind did this," Dan said with certainty. "This was sabotage. Someone wanted to cause you trouble and expense." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she remembered Jake Morrison's parting words the day before. She caught Dan's eye and saw that he was thinking the same thing. "Any idea who might have it in for you?" Dan asked carefully. Thomas looked confused, but Sarah knew she had to speak up. "Father, there was some trouble in town yesterday. Some men. They weren't very kind to me." She gave him a carefully edited version of the events, leaving out the worst of the cruelty, but explaining about the confrontation and Morrison's threats. Thomas's face grew darker with each word. "You should have told me," he said when she finished. "I won't have my daughter terrorized by a pack of drunken fools." "That's exactly why I didn't tell you," Sarah replied firmly. "You're not well enough to be starting fights, and we can't afford to make enemies of the people in town." "Maybe not," Dan interjected, "but you can't afford to let them think you're easy targets either. Men like Morrison only understand strength." He turned to Thomas, his expression serious. "Mr. Mitchell, I think you should know that I made it pretty clear to Morrison and his friends that bothering Miss Mitchell would be a serious mistake. It's possible they decided to take their anger out on your property instead." Thomas absorbed this information, his jaw working as he thought it through. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Well then, I guess we'd better make sure nothing else gets broken. Dan, if you're serious about staying on, your first job is helping us secure this place." "Yes, sir. I'll start by fixing this door properly. Then we should check the rest of the buildings and the fence lines. If they came once, they might come again." As the men returned to their work, Sarah went back to the house to start breakfast, but her mind wasn't on cooking. Instead, she found herself thinking about the way Dan had looked at the sabotaged door, the grim professionalism in his assessment. There was more to Daniel Hartwell than met the eye, and she was beginning to suspect that his arrival at their ranch was the best thing that had happened to them in years. Over the next few days, Dan threw himself into the work with an energy that impressed even old Pete. He repaired the barn door, fixed the leaking roof, and strengthened the corral fence. More importantly, he did it all with a quiet competence that made the work look easy. Sarah found herself looking forward to meal times, when Dan would join them at the kitchen table and tell stories of his travels. He had a gift for storytelling, painting vivid pictures of cattle drives across endless plains, dramatic storms that turned day to night, and the characters he had met along the way. Worked with a cowhand in Kansas who claimed he could rope a prairie dog from 50 yards, Dan said one evening as Sarah served up a stew made from one of their chickens. Turned out he was right, but he never mentioned that the prairie dog had to be dead first. Thomas laughed until he started coughing, but even then his eyes were bright with humor. Sarah realized it had been months since she had heard her father truly laugh, and she felt a surge of gratitude toward Dan for bringing some lightness back into their home. "What about family?" Thomas asked when his coughing subsided. "You got people somewhere wondering where you are?" Dan's expression grew more serious. "Parents died when I was 15. Influenza took them both within a week of each other. No brothers or sisters." "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly, recognizing the pain that flickered across his features. "It was a long time ago. Dan replied, but she could tell the wound still ached. Been on my own ever since. Makes a man appreciate good company when he finds it. That night, as Sarah cleaned the dishes, she found herself thinking about Dan's story. The loss of his parents explained something about the sadness she sometimes glimpsed in his eyes, but it also made his kindness toward her all the more remarkable. He knew what it was like to be alone in the world, to face hardship without family to support him. The next morning brought trouble in the form of dust on the horizon. Sarah was hanging laundry when she spotted the riders approaching, and her heart sank as she recognized the lead figure. Jake Morrison was back, and this time he had brought friends. She ran to the barn where Dan and Pete were working on a new stall. "Riders coming," she said breathlessly. "It's Morrison." Dan was moving before she finished speaking, striding to where his rifle leaned against the barn wall. Pete followed suit, grabbing an old shotgun from behind a feed barrel. "How many?" Dan asked, checking his rifle with practiced efficiency. 5, maybe 6. "Pete, get Mr. Mitchell and tell him to stay in the house. Sarah, you go with him." "This is my ranch too," Sarah protested. "I'm not hiding while others fight my battles." Dan turned to look at her, and she was struck by the intensity in his green eyes. "This isn't about hiding. It's about being smart. Morrison and his friends are looking for trouble, and I'd rather not give them any excuses to escalate things." Before Sarah could argue further, the riders came into the yard. Morrison sat his horse with the swagger of a man who thought he held all the cards, and the men with him looked like the kind of hired muscle that could be found in any frontier saloon. Dan stepped out of the barn, his rifle held casually but ready. Pete flanked him, the shotgun cradled in his arms with the familiarity of long experience. "Morning, Morrison," Dan said pleasantly. "Awful early to be paying social calls." Morrison's face flushed at the casual dismissal. "I didn't come to talk to you, stranger. I came to discuss business with Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell is indisposed at the moment. I'm handling ranch business in his absence. Since when does a hired hand speak for the owner?" "Since the owner asked me to," Dan replied smoothly. "Now, what's this business you want to discuss?" Morrison shifted in his saddle, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "There's been talk in town about this place being a bad influence. Decent folks don't like having undesirables so close to civilization." "Undesirables?" Dan's voice remained level, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. That woman with her face all carved up, frightening children and decent folk. Some people think it would be better if this family moved on to some place where they'd fit in better. And where would that be? Morrison shrugged. Some place where freaks belong. Maybe back east where there's hospitals and such for people like her. Dan took a step forward, and Sarah noticed that several of Morrison's men shifted nervously in their saddles. "Let me make sure I understand you correctly. You're suggesting that the Mitchells should abandon their legally owned property because some people in town don't like looking at a young woman who was injured in an accident? I'm suggesting they'd be happier somewhere else. And the town would be happier too." "Well now, that's interesting." Dan's voice carried the same conversational tone that Sarah remembered from their first meeting, and she felt a chill run down her spine. "See, where I come from, we have a saying about people who try to drive families off their own land. We call them thieves and cowards." Morrison's face went purple with rage. "You got no call to speak to me like that, you drifting saddle tramp." "Oh, but I do." Dan's rifle came up slightly, not quite pointing at Morrison, but making its presence unmistakably clear. "I've got every right to speak my mind on my own employer's property. And I've got every right to defend this ranch against anyone who comes here making threats." "We ain't made no threats," one of Morrison's companions spoke up, his voice nervous. "Really?" Dan's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "Because it sure sounded like you were suggesting the Mitchells leave their home or face unpleasant consequences. In most places, that's called extortion." Morrison seemed to realize that the conversation was not going the way he had planned. His men were clearly having second thoughts about facing down two armed and determined ranch hands, especially when one of them had already demonstrated his skill with a gun. "This ain't over," Morrison snarled, echoing his words from the alley. "Yes, it is," Dan replied calmly. And let me explain why. If anything happens to this ranch or anyone on it, the first place I'm going to look for answers is your front door. If I find evidence that you or your friends were involved, I won't bother with the sheriff or the law. I'll handle things my own way." The threat hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Morrison stared at Dan for a long moment, clearly trying to decide if he was bluffing. Whatever he saw in the younger man's eyes convinced him that Dan meant every word. "Come on, boys," Morrison said finally, wheeling his horse around. "We've got better things to do than waste time with hired help." As the riders disappeared in a cloud of dust, Sarah emerged from the barn where she had been watching. Her hands were shaking with delayed reaction to the confrontation. "That was magnificent," she said breathlessly. Dan turned to look at her, and she was surprised to see worry rather than satisfaction in his expression. "No, it wasn't." "What do you mean?" "Men like Morrison don't give up when they're face down. They just get sneakier." Dan lowered his rifle but didn't relax his vigilance. "He'll be back, but next time he won't announce himself with a dust cloud." Pete spat into the dirt with disgust. "Should have put a bullet in his worthless hide when we had the chance. That would have made us the criminals," Dan replied. "Better to let him make the first illegal move. Then we'll have the law on our side when we respond." Sarah felt a chill at his words. "You think they'll try something else? I'd bet money on it. Morrison's pride is hurt, and he's got a reputation to maintain with those men of his. He'll have to do something to save face." As they walked back toward the house, Sarah found herself studying Dan's profile. There was something about the way he had handled the confrontation that suggested this wasn't his first time dealing with this kind of trouble. He had been calm, professional, almost military in his bearing. "Dan," she said hesitantly, "what did you do before you became a cowhand?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "I was a Texas Ranger for 3 years after my parents died. Learned a lot about men like Morrison in that time." The revelation explained much about his confidence and competence, but it also raised new questions. Why had he left the Rangers? What had brought him to their small ranch? As if reading her thoughts, Dan stopped walking and turned to face her. "Sarah, there's something you need to understand. Morrison isn't just angry about being embarrassed. There's money involved here, and that makes him dangerous." "What kind of money?" "Your father mentioned that you owe money to the bank. Morrison works for the banker's daughter, doesn't he? The one who is leading that mob in town?" Sarah nodded, beginning to see where his thoughts were leading. "If this ranch gets foreclosed, who benefits? Who gets to buy it for a fraction of its real value?" The implications hit her like a physical blow. "You think they're trying to drive us off so they can take the land?" "I think it's a strong possibility, and that means they won't stop with broken doors and threats. They'll keep escalating until they find something that works." Sarah felt the weight of their situation settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. They were caught between their debt to the bank and the malice of people who wanted to see them fail. For a moment, the odds seemed impossible. Then she looked at Dan, standing there in the morning sun with his rifle in his hands and determination written across his features, and she felt hope stir in her chest. They weren't alone anymore. They had an ally, and not just any ally, but a former Texas Ranger who clearly knew how to handle trouble. "What do we do?" she asked. Dan's smile was grim but confident. "We get ready for war." The attack came 3 nights later, just as Dan had predicted. Sarah was awakened by the smell of smoke and the frantic lowing of cattle. She threw on her robe and rushed outside to see orange flames licking at the hay barn, while dark figures moved through their pasture, driving the cattle toward the creek. Dan was already running toward the fire, shouting orders to Pete, who had emerged from his quarters above the main barn. "Form a line to the well." But even as they fought the flames, Sarah could see it was too late to save the barn. The dry hay had caught quickly, and the fire was spreading faster than they could control it. Their winter feed supply was going up in smoke. "The cattle!" Sarah screamed, pointing toward the pasture where she could see men on horseback driving their small herd toward the property line. Dan's face was grim in the firelight. "Pete, keep fighting the fire. Sarah, get your father and get him armed." "They're trying to steal everything we have!" Sarah ran toward the house, her bare feet flying over the hard-packed dirt of the yard. She burst through the front door to find her father already struggling into his clothes, his face pale but determined. "Rustlers," she gasped. "They're taking the cattle while we fight the fire." Thomas reached for his old army Colt, checking the cylinder with movements made automatic by years of practice. "How many?" "I couldn't tell. At least 4 or 5 on horseback." "Where's Dan?" "Fighting the fire, but he said to get you armed." Thomas nodded grimly. "Smart boy. They're hoping we'll choose between the barn and the cattle. Time to show them we can handle both." They ran back outside to find Dan had given up on the barn and was saddling his horse with swift, efficient movements. The fire was blazing out of control now, lighting up the night sky like a beacon. "Mr. Mitchell," Dan called out as he swung into the saddle. "Can you handle things here? Go get our cattle back, son. Pete and I can manage the fire." Dan nodded and spurred his horse toward the pasture. Sarah watched him disappear into the darkness, her heart pounding with fear for his safety. 5 against 1 was not good odds, even for a former Texas Ranger. The next hour was the longest of Sarah's life. She and her father worked alongside Pete to keep the fire from spreading to the main barn, using wet blankets and buckets of water to beat down the flames wherever they threatened to jump. The hay barn was lost, but they managed to save everything else. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they heard the sound of cattle approaching. Sarah looked up from where she was tending to her father, who had collapsed in a coughing fit, to see Dan driving their herd back into the pasture, but he wasn't alone. 2 horses followed behind him, each carrying a body draped over the saddle. Dan rode up to the house, his face black with smoke and dirt, his shirt torn from catching bullets that had come too close. But he was alive and their cattle were safe. "Are they dead?" Thomas asked, gesturing toward the bodies. "One is. The other will live, but he won't be causing any more trouble." Dan's voice was flat, emotionless. "Found them driving the herd toward the Thompson place. Seemed like an odd coincidence." Sarah felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Thompson? As in Rebecca Thompson's father?" "The very same. Turns out her daddy has been planning to expand his holdings, and this ranch sits right in the middle of the land he wants." The implications were staggering. The bank president had been orchestrating their persecution, using his daughter's social influence and Morrison's thugs to drive them off land he wanted to acquire cheaply through foreclosure. "What about the sheriff?" Pete asked, speaking for the first time since the attack began. "On his way," Dan replied. "I sent word with one of the wounded men. Figured it was time to make this legal and official." Indeed, within an hour, Sheriff Williams arrived with a small posse. He was a decent man in his 50s, honest but sometimes overwhelmed by the politics of his position. His face was troubled as he examined the evidence. "This is a serious situation," he said after hearing their story. "Rustling is a hanging offense, and arson isn't far behind." "What about Thompson's involvement?" Dan asked pointedly. The sheriff's discomfort was obvious. "That's going to be harder to prove. These men could have been acting on their own." "Could have been," Dan agreed, "but I don't think so. And I think you know it too." Sheriff Williams sighed heavily. "Knowing and proving are 2 different things, Dan. Thompson has a lot of influence in this county." "More influence than the law?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Finally, the sheriff straightened his shoulders, seeming to come to a decision. No, he doesn't. I'll be paying him a visit this morning, and I'll be asking some hard questions about what his men were doing driving stolen cattle toward his property." As the sheriff and his posse rode away with their prisoners, Sarah found herself alone with Dan for the first time since the attack. They stood in the ruins of the hay barn, surrounded by the acrid smell of smoke and ash. "How bad is it?" she asked, gesturing toward the destruction. "Bad enough. We lost most of your winter feed, and buying more will cost money you don't have." Dan's honesty was brutal but necessary. "On the other hand, we still have the cattle, the main barn, and the house, and now the law knows what Thompson has been up to. Will that be enough to stop him?" Dan was quiet for a moment, studying the horizon where smoke still rose from the smoldering hay. "Maybe." Depends on how badly he wants this land and how much risk he's willing to take. Sarah felt tears threatening and turned away to hide them. They had come so close to losing everything, and even now their situation was precarious. Without hay for the winter, they would have to sell cattle they couldn't afford to lose, or watch them starve when the cold weather came. "Hey," Dan said softly, moving to stand beside her. "We're not beaten yet, aren't we? We can't buy hay, we can't pay the bank, and Thompson isn't going to give up just because he lost this round." Dan reached out and gently turned her face toward him, his calloused hand warm against her cheek. "Sarah, look at me." She met his eyes, seeing strength and determination that made her own courage flicker back to life. "I've been thinking about that horse breeding idea," he said. "Your father's stallion, Thunder, is good stock. With the right mares, you could build something profitable here. With what money? We can barely afford feed for the cattle we have. I've got some money saved. Not a fortune, but enough to get started. And I know where we can get good mares at a fair price." Sarah stared at him in amazement. "You're talking about investing your own money in our ranch? Why would you do that?" Dan's hand was still cupping her face, his thumb gently tracing the line of her scar. The gesture was so tender, so accepting that it took her breath away. "Because I believe in you," he said simply. "In your father, in this place, in what we could build here together. Together, if you'll have me. Not just as a hired hand, but as a partner. Someone who's invested in making this ranch succeed." Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Was he saying what she thought he was saying? "Dan, I know what people say about you in town," he interrupted gently. "I know what they call you, how they treat you. But when I look at you, I don't see any of that. I see a woman with strength and courage, someone who survived hardship that would have broken lesser people. I see someone worth fighting for." The tears came then, flowing freely down her cheeks. For 3 years she had believed the cruel words and sideways glances. She had accepted that she was damaged, unworthy of love or respect. But here was this remarkable man telling her she was worth fighting for. "I'm not whole," she whispered. "I'm scarred inside and out." "We all have scars," Dan replied. "Some are just more visible than others. Yours don't make you less beautiful or less worthy. They make you stronger." Before she could respond, he leaned down and kissed her, soft and gentle and full of promise. It was the first time anyone had kissed her since the accident, and she felt something inside her that had been broken begin to heal. When they broke apart, Sarah was breathless and shining. "You really want to stay? Even knowing what you'll face in town, what people will say. Let them say what they want. I found something worth staying for." The sound of approaching horses interrupted them, and they turned to see Sheriff Williams returning, his face grim but satisfied. "Thought you'd want to know," he called out as he rode up. "Had a long talk with Mr. Pinnessy. Thompson. Turns out he's decided that his business interests would be better served in another county. He'll be moving his operations to Dallas within the month." Dan's eyebrows rose. "That seems like a sudden decision. Amazing how sudden these decisions can be when a man realizes the alternative might involve federal charges for conspiracy and rustling." The sheriff's smile was thin but genuine. "Also turns out he's willing to forgive the outstanding debt on this ranch as part of his relocation expenses." Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief. "The debt is forgiven?" "Every penny. Seems Mr. Meyer, Thompson, wants to start fresh in Dallas without any entanglements from his time here." As the sheriff rode away, Sarah turned to Dan with wonder in her eyes. "It's over. It's really over." "This part is," Dan agreed. "Now the real work begins." Over the next few months, the ranch began to transform under Dan's guidance and investment. They bought 3 excellent mares and began the careful process of breeding that would eventually make the Mitchell Ranch known throughout Texas for its fine horses. The cattle herd grew as well, fattened on new pastures that Dan helped them purchase with his savings. But the most remarkable transformation was in Sarah herself. Under Dan's patient encouragement, she began to hold her head high again, to see herself through his eyes rather than the cruel mirror of town gossip. When they made their weekly trips to town for supplies, she walked beside him with confidence, meeting the stares of former tormentors with calm dignity. Rebecca Thompson had left with her father, but even if she had stayed, Sarah doubted her words would have the same power to wound. It was hard to be hurt by someone calling you a monster when the man you loved looked at you like you were the most beautiful woman in the world. The wedding was held on a crisp autumn day, with old Pete serving as Dan's best man and the new preacher from the Methodist Church performing the ceremony. Thomas Mitchell had recovered much of his strength as his worries about the ranch's future faded, and he walked his daughter down the aisle with pride shining in his eyes. The people of Willow Creek came to the wedding, drawn by curiosity and perhaps a touch of shame for their past treatment of the bride. They watched in amazement as Dan lifted Sarah's veil and kissed her with obvious love and devotion, neither of them seeming to notice or care about the scar that had once made her an outcast. As the years passed, the story of the cowboy who came to Sarah's rescue became part of local legend. Children who had never known the cruelty of the earlier time grew up hearing about the ranger who saw past a woman's scars to the beauty beneath, and the love that transformed a failing ranch into one of the most successful operations in the county. Sarah and Dan raised 4 children on the ranch, teaching them the values of hard work, kindness, and the courage to stand up for what's right. The children grew up strong and confident, surrounded by the love of parents who had found in each other the missing pieces of their souls. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the children were asleep, Sarah would sometimes run her fingers along the scar that had once been her shame. Dan would catch her hand and kiss it gently, reminding her, without words, that their love had grown from pain into something beautiful and strong. The ranch prospered under their joint management, becoming known throughout Texas for both its horses and its hospitality. Travelers were always welcome at the Mitchell table, and many left with stories of the remarkable couple who had built something wonderful from the ashes of cruelty and despair. Old Pete lived to see the ranch's success, taking great pride in his role as the first to recognize Dan's worth. He would often tell visitors about the day the young ranger rode into their lives, bringing with him the hope and determination that saved not just the ranch, but the family that called it home. Sarah never forgot the lessons learned during those dark days when stones were thrown and cruel words cut deeper than any physical wound. She became known throughout the county for her kindness to outcasts and her fierce protection of anyone facing the kind of persecution she had once endured. The hay barn was rebuilt within a year, bigger and better than before, but Sarah insisted on leaving a small section of the original foundation visible, a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything and how much they had gained by refusing to give up. In time, Sarah's scar faded to a thin silver line, barely visible unless someone was looking for it. But more importantly, the scars on her heart healed completely, replaced by the deep joy that comes from being truly known and loved. The last chapter of their story was still being written when Sarah's own grandchildren began to play in the same yard where she had once hidden from cruel stares. They called her Grandma Sarah, and they thought she was the most beautiful woman in the world, just as their grandfather had always told them. And on summer evenings, when the work was done and the family gathered on the porch to watch the sunset paint the sky, Sarah would catch Dan's eye and smile. He would wink back, and in that simple exchange was all the poetry of their love story. The cowboy who came to her rescue and stayed to build a life. The woman who learned that her worth was not defined by other people's cruelty, and the love that had transformed them both. The stones had long since been forgotten, the cruel words buried beneath years of laughter and joy. What remained was the truth that had always been there beneath the surface, that real beauty comes from the inside, and real love sees past any flaw to the perfect heart beneath. Their ranch became a symbol of hope for anyone who had ever been told they were less than worthy, proof that with courage, kindness, and the right person standing beside you, any story could have a happy ending. And in the rolling hills of Texas, where the wind still sang through the grass and thunder's descendants ran free in the pastures, their love story continued to inspire generations of dreamers who believed that somewhere out there, their own cowboy might be riding toward them across the prairie.